Yo, this is crazy to me. Check this out. So I'm here pulling my hair out trying to do my taxes because the truth is it's been a couple of years since I've done them, and I know that tax evasion is a felony charge, so don't tell anyone. But I got to thinking, what really is the point of all this? Why do I need to pay the government every year or else I risk going to jail? Why are taxes so important? You know, this is actually a really good question that I'm sure you're going to learn a lot of new stuff about. But before we get to your question, I think this will all make a lot more sense if we first look at how the US government works. Every year, the government holds what's called an appropriations process, or the annual meeting where Congress creates the discretionary spending budget, using these things called appropriation bills. You see, the US government spends its budget in two ways: mandatory spending budget and the discretionary spending budget. The amount of discretionary spending allowed is set by the appropriation bills. For example, there's an appropriations bill for NASA spending budget, one for education spending budget, one for military spending budget. You get the point. But mandatory spending is completely different. Mandatory spending includes things like Social Security and Medicare benefits, but it's called mandatory spending for a reason. This spending is not decided in the annual appropriations meeting like discretionary spending is. Instead, this spending is decided by the law. Meaning, for all mandatory spending programs, by law, the government must do whatever it has to do to keep these programs running. Meaning the only way that you can change the spending budget for things like Social Security benefits, for example, would be to pretty much change the law, which will require the majority vote in the Senate. And when you have parties like the Republican Party, Democratic Party, Green Party, and all these different point of views, that may not be the easiest thing to do. But to bring it full circle and answer your question, taxes are important because it's where most governments get most of their spending budget from, in which they then take this spending budget and spend it on all types of public programs that will be really hard, or if not impossible, to afford without your tax payments, especially on the scale of the US government. Without your tax payments, the US government would either have to look into other ways of making money, make some serious budget cuts, or would have to close its doors forever, leaving its people to figure it out on their own. Well, alright, so taxes are important because the government funds a lot of programs, and that funding mostly comes from taxpayers. Okay, but we have to pay taxes in so many ways. There's sales tax, there's property tax, there's even a withholding tax that comes out of all my paychecks. On top of all of this, why do we have to pay the government every year? Well, to be honest, generally speaking, you shouldn't have to pay anything come tax season. In fact, most are waiting for a refund from the government. You ever look down at your paycheck every week or two and you see that large chunk of taxes removed from your paycheck? Well, that's actually called tax withholding, or the amount of money removed from each paycheck and given to the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS for short. If you never knew this was happening, it's likely that you're either upset or confused. But the truth is that you should actually be thankful for this, because without this system in place, every year come tax season, you'd be expected to pay a few $1,000 bill to the government, or else you might face some jail time. But thanks to the government knowing that chances are likely that you're either really bad with money management, or you would do everything in your power to not have to pay this much in taxes every year. They don't have enough law enforcement in jails to keep this fear alive, and without this system, they wouldn't be able to fund some mandatory spending. And so they created withhold taxes, in which they withhold taxes from every single paycheck. And here's a lesser known fact. You can even tell your employer how much money you want withheld from every paycheck. If you're interested in optimizing how much money you have to spend or how much money you get back come tax season, just talk to your employer about the W-4 to make sure the government runs as smooth as possible. But there are some issues. As I'm sure you already know, there are these... Wait, sorry to interrupt, very sorry. But if every paycheck my employer takes a chunk out and gives it right to the IRS, what's the point of me filing every year anyway, only to get money back? Actually, this is a great interruption question because it's actually really important. Now, there are a few different reasons why tax season is still around. The most obvious answer is because not everyone who makes money also has an employer. Especially now in the age of the internet, many have the power to work for themselves or within small teams. which pretty much makes them only have to pay one large lump sum of taxes come tax season. Now, the reason why you get money back is actually really easy to understand. The withheld taxes that are sent to the IRS throughout the year is added up, and then come tax season, your refund is then a very easy equation. How much money you paid in taxes, represented as P, minus how much money you owe in taxes, represented as O, will be how much you're refunded or still owe, represented as T. And back to the W-4 form mentioned earlier, some people choose to withhold a lot more than the average so that they can get back a bigger refund. This means that you'll have a smaller spending budget. And on the other side, some choose to withhold a lot less so that they can have a bigger spending budget. But of course, this might equal in having to owe in taxes. But please do take in mind that taxes... Wow. Boring screen math, you really don't go away unless I give you attention, huh? Boring screen math, you are so needy. Sorry guys, give me a second while I erase boring screen math here. Sorry about that. But please do keep in mind that taxes are not this black and white. There are different tax margins, or also known as tax brackets, to some, that is based on your income. You can work half the time for an employer and the other half work for yourself, which you still would have to pay taxes on the other half of that income if it wasn't taxed. Some income, like a $100 gift card, doesn't need to be taxed, and yeah, it can get pretty tricky. But basically, getting rid of taxes would mean only those who have an employer would ever have to pay income taxes, allowing for anyone who's self-employed to maybe never have to pay income taxes. And not to mention, those who look forward to their refund may never get it back. Most interesting. So tax season is a way to make sure that everyone, no matter their job, supports the government's spending budget with the money that they've earned, as well as gives the government a chance to pay back whatever money that they've withheld extra of. This is actually a lot easier to understand than I first thought. But back to the question that I am dying to know. Is it illegal to not file my income tax? Oh boy, this is perhaps the most debated question in recent years. So let's start by looking at it from a very easy angle. Not everyone who makes money also makes money legally. There are many black markets out there to make someone very rich, and so the annual tax season gives the government a great tool to see who's making money legally and who isn't. But it didn't always used to be this way. So let's take a quick trip back through history to see what I'm talking about. The year is 1913. The current president is Woodrow Wilson, and most of the government spending budget comes from tariffs, or the fees on importing and exporting goods and services, but also from selling postage stamps and tobacco and alcohol taxes. President Woodrow Wilson sees a huge need to lower tariff fees to better the nation, and so he campaigns for lower tariff fees. He later succeeds, but now a new problem arises. With tariffs no longer being the main source for the government spending budget, they are in need of something new to make up for this loss. And the answer was the reintroduction of income tax. Now you see, income tax has been tried before President Woodrow Wilson. In fact, it was first introduced in 1861 by President Abraham Lincoln to help fund the U.S. Civil War. But in 1872, the Supreme Court found income tax to be unconstitutional and repealed it. But through serious campaigning and influence, President Woodrow Wilson was not only able to bring back income tax, but he also made it constitutional by making it the 16th Amendment. Very impressive stuff if you ask me, but there is more to this historical event than meets the eye. So the 16th Amendment pretty much made it mandatory to pay a tax on your income every year no matter what your income is. So now let's fast forward some 10 years and introduce this guy, Al Capone. The decade is now the 1920s, and Al Capone is what some would say on top of the world. Prohibition, or the period in U.S. history when alcohol was completely illegal, was in full effect, and Al Capone was taking advantage of the U.S. demand for the then illegal alcohol, running a huge illegal business mostly dealing illegal alcohol. But this also brought lots of death and chaos, like the St. Valentine's Massacre, which terrified the nation. What made Al Capone so legendary from most other mobsters in US history was that he was raking in so much money and was really hard for the government to take down. He would beat some court cases or go to jail for only short periods, survive assassination attempts, pay off government officials and law enforcement for protection, and much, much more. All in which made it really hard to put an end to his illegal activities. That is, of course, until the government thought up of a new, rather smart plan. In 1927, after the Supreme Court ruled that, yes, even illegal incomes are taxable, this gave the government perhaps the most powerful tool for income tax enforcement to this date. And so, they started a special investigation on Al Capone's income. The plan was simple. Request a tax return from Al Capone, causing him to get trapped in a corner. If he refuses to give a tax return, well, that's tax evasion, a felony charge. And if he does give a tax return, but doesn't prove legit sources to cover the millions of dollars he was spending, well, thanks to the Supreme Court's new ruling, that now too falls under tax evasion, which again is a felony charge. And lastly, if he does give a tax return and has legit sources to cover the millions he was spending, but his legit sources are from illegal activities, then he'd be charged with whatever illegal activities he confesses to. There was simply no win for Al Capone here. And spoiler alert for the Al Capone documentary, but he gets charged with 11 years for tax evasion, proving that the government's smart plan was a success. And ever since then, the government has been expanding on its tax evasion methods, investigating average citizens, rich businessmen, infamous criminals, and even government officials. Now, in addition to all that information, hold on. I just want to pause and make it really clear the power that the 1927 Supreme Court ruling gave to the government. Even if you make illegal income, be it an illegal drug smuggler or a human trafficker, hired assassin, or what have you, the 1927 Supreme Court ruling says that no matter where you get your money from, you have to pay taxes on your income to support the government. But when you pay taxes on illegal income, you risk a chance of telling on yourself, being investigated by the government, and maybe even busted for it at some point. Funny enough, I actually have a little footage of what this is like. Roll clip.
A Rockville man on the scene of a house fire today just walked up to police and said he set the fire.
Me, I set it on fire. I just poured gasoline on the floor, set it on fire, and went to buy a drink and came back. I set it on fire.
You set it on fire?
Yeah.
Despite his candor and sincerity, officers handcuffed Carlos and walked him to a squad car. Charges are pending.
But if you choose not to call attention to yourself, your only real option at that point is just to not file your income tax at all, which could also be a felony charge. This is kind of like the government's way of declaring checkmate on you no matter what illegal activities you make money from. Because the only real way to avoid felony charges is just to not do anything illegal. Now, of course, there is the option of money laundering to throw off the government, but this isn't the instruction on how to build an illegal enterprise. Just stay out of trouble and pay your taxes on time, my friends. Okay, this was kind of a long interruption, so I'll rewind it a bit for you. Now, in addition to all that information, one might ask, well, why is the US government so aggressive on income tax exactly? Well, from the previous example, being aggressive on income tax shows that it helps to stop the next Al Capone from happening. But also, out of all the taxes, taxing personal income is where the government gets most of its spending budget from. Have a look at this government spending budget chart. This shows that 33% came from withheld taxes, 11% came from corporate income, the other 9% came from other things, and a whopping 47% of government spending budget comes from taxing personal income. That's a lot, but that's actually not the whole picture. Remember, withheld taxes also come straight out of your paycheck, which also counts as personal income. So if we were to revisualize this chart, it'd look more like this. Taxing personal income is 80%, taxing corporate income is 11%, and all other is 9%. So if you think about it from the government's point of view, they are currently very dependent on taxing personal income. So they need to do everything that they can to make sure that everyone pays their fair share, so that they have enough money to make sure that they can keep all of their programs alive and running. And what better way to make sure that everyone pays than with fear? Like the fear of a lengthy prison sentence. Whoa, that's really fascinating. So filing my income taxes is important not only because it supports my government, but it also lets the government know that I am a completely good and legal citizen. Understood. But you weren't quite clear. Is it illegal to not file my income tax or not? Yeah, see about that. This is so hard to talk about because it's kind of controversial. Those who believe that we don't or shouldn't have to pay taxes, no matter if they have anything to hide or not, they're generally called tax protesters by many. And here are some of their beliefs. Forcing citizens to share income figures violates the Fifth Amendment of being a witness against themselves. Taking private property for public use without equal reward also violates the Fifth Amendment. And to be fair, historical Supreme Court ruling is on their side with the Fifth Amendment argument. President Woodrow Wilson's 16th Amendment was not created the right way. Real monetary value is based on the gold standard, so Federal Reserve notes don't count as income. There is a loophole with the whole voluntary tax phrasing used with withheld taxes, and the list goes on. Now, about this. To a certain degree, yes, we can all have our own interpretations on taxing powers and what it all means, but the problem is that your interpretation is making some very serious decisions. If you interpret from data that Cox will be a better internet service provider in the long run, then so be it, just switch over. The government isn't going to make you argue your want to change providers in court. But if you interpret that you don't have to support the government spending budget, make sure that you really understand what you're up against and well prepared for it. Because even if your interpretation is 100% correct and you have undeniable proof as to why you don't have to pay taxes, at this point with the US government relying on taxing personal income for 80% of its spending budget, I'm sure the US government rather drop nuclear bombs on itself before letting you win such a case. Because when the news gets out that you've won a case against the US government for not having to pay taxes, you could damage 80% of their spending budget, inspiring millions of others to follow in your footsteps. Just to be clear, we're talking about power here. But besides all that stuff, there's also the very simple fact that the nation needs you. It needs your contribution so that it can fund the public education and student aid that you, your family, your friends, and many that you interact with on a daily basis have used and learned from. The public transportation and public highways that help millions get around daily. The public broadcasting that has helped inspire millions. The satellites in orbit that help make watching all your favorite internet shows even possible. And of course, the military, civil services, and regulatory programs that help keep you and your loved ones safe and healthy. While I'm sure there are other fitting models out there that don't need a government, or a government that gets its spending budget without taxing personal incomes, the reality is this is just currently what we have to deal with. It's my new belief that we need not to focus on trying to get out of paying taxes, but instead we need to focus a lot more on changing what the government is spending our tax money on. Because to me, I think that being proud and supportive of how our government is spending our tax money would make paying taxes a lot easier for us all. I see. So even if I don't think that paying taxes is necessary, I should still pay my income tax to support my fellow citizens, and instead change my focus to what the government is spending my tax money on. That actually sounds like a great idea. Huh! You sheep. Okay. So final question. Why is there a sales tax on food in California, but only sometimes? No, absolutely not. It's too confusing. Something about hot or cold food that's ordered to go or not to go, that's in a leap year, on a blue moon with the eclipse. It's too confusing. Just end the episode. I'm not doing this one. Not even trying. Well, alright. I must admit, I had no idea that the taxes for my income were so important. Honestly, I just never thought that far through. I've always viewed it as greedy government sucking me of my money. And I think part of the reason for this is because a lot of the good stuff that the government does for us has been normalized, making it harder to see our money in action. While it will never be easy for me to part ways with my money, I've learned that the answer is not to try and find ways out of not paying taxes, but instead to do what I can to change what the government is spending my tax money on, so that way I can become a more proud and supportive taxpayer. Because when you deeply think about it, tax season is something that should be celebrated. We should all take pride in funding the agreed programs that make our countries as great as they can be. Man, taxes are such an interesting topic. I'm glad to know that much more about the tax process. But today, I have one simple question for you. If you had the power to, would you cut your government spending budget in order to pay less in taxes? Cast your vote by clicking that question on screen. It should be in the top right corner. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this topic, so please come continue this conversation with me on Twitter. @SefStuff is my handle. I hope that you all found something curious about taxes today, but whatever the case may be, remember to always feed your curiosity.